Welcome back. I am John P. Today, we are going to be talking about 5 watch features or complications that collectors often complain about. Here's the thing. Some people just like to complain, right? I personally am not like this. I like to try to remain positive and look at the bright side of everything. And that's also what we do at delraywatch.com, where, by the way, we are truly having some phenomenal deals with everything that's going on in the watch market. Currently, there's a bit of a pullback, especially on Rolex, Patek AP. So, certainly we don't have many of those left in stocks. We're kind of shifting our focus to the brands that we always really loved and enjoyed, like some of the brands that offered a lot of great value, like Girard-Perregaux, Grand Seiko, and so many other great enthusiast-grade brands, including H. Moser. So check that out, Del Rey Watch. But what I'm saying is, I always look at the bright side of things, try to remain positive, but sometimes people just like to complain. So I'm going to share with you the 5 things that watch collectors complain about in terms of the features of the watch and why actually they're really not that bad things, and also explain why they are positive. Now, before we do that, on the wrist today, I do have a complicated watch. It's a Gerald Genta, very special limited edition, limited production version of a Gerald Genta jump hour watch. It's a complication where essentially there's a window where the hour jumps, much like you would see the changeover in a date wheel, but it's the hour wheel, and this one is very special, so you can check out more about this as well as what goes on behind the scenes at Del Rey Watch on my Instagram, The Real John P. So without further ado, the first complication that watch collectors complain all the time about is perpetual calendars. Now, a perpetual calendar is going to have the functionality that keeps track of many things in terms of the date, right? It's going to have the date, it's going to have the time, it's going to have the day. It oftentimes has the moon phase. But what's special about the perpetual calendar compared to something like an annual calendar is it actually accounts for the 4-year cycles that denote a leap year and makes that jump over, whereas annual calendars don't do that for you. And this is quite a technological feat, right? It requires more advanced tooling, it requires more production capabilities, and in today's watchmaking world with advanced machinery and computers and advanced design, this is not the biggest feat any longer. Perpetual calendars have been out for a very long time, but it is truly one of those complications that just is nice to have, just to have it if you like it. It also makes the dials more busy. Personally, I really enjoy the Jaeger Lecoultre or the JLC perpetual calendar from the early 2000s, late 1990s. I just love it, and I think these are also a great buy. But by the way, this video was inspired by a friend, Marco. If you're watching this, you inspired this video. And he asked pretty much about perpetual calendars. I was letting him know I was probably going to be adding one to my collection. And he asked, why do people complain about it? And the reason people complain is that if you don't wear the watch every day and you let it sit, right, these are automatic watches for the most part, it's going to miss days. You have to reset everything by hand. And also some perpetual calendars, they can be difficult to set, if not impossible for the average person to set, if on the year indicator you go too far, right? If it's 2022, you keep pushing, you push it to 2023 by accident, you're just setting the time or you're playing with it. Some watches truly do have to be readjusted or set back in time by a watchmaker or the manufacturer. This happens with IWC perpetual calendars, including the older IWC perpetual calendars. But these 2 main nuances are oftentimes why people complain. But the reality is with watches, we don't need any of these features for the most part to live our lives. We have phones, we have computers, so on and so forth. You get it, you understand. I think some people just like to make a mountain out of a molehill. I love perpetual calendars. What do you think about them? Comments below. Now, next we have tourbillons. Now, what is a tourbillon? Well, essentially a tourbillon, in simplistic terms, is a functionality or a feature that is very intricate and advanced that comes from the days of pocket watches that was intended to make watches or timekeeping more accurate, taking mechanical timekeeping devices and making it more accurate by counteracting the forces of gravity by placing some of the mechanical components, the escapement, in a cage that is suspended and rotates, and that's supposed to essentially counteract the forces of gravity of the movement of the mechanical parts. And was truly phenomenal and advanced when it came out. But today, with modern watchmaking and timekeeping, it's really not adding a lot of value besides the horological value. Now, we had a double tourbillon Cartier, very special Cartier watch that we just sent off to a great new home. And the thing is, they're just gorgeous to look at. They're beautiful, they're works of art, they're advanced, right? But it's not going to be a watch that you're going to want to everyday wear, especially if you're active, you're going to the car wash, you're going to the grocery store, you're doing these things, you're taking the kids to soccer practice, things like that. You probably don't want to wear a tourbillon because they are advanced in that way, and they're not going to be the most reliable if you're exposing it to all these forces that the tourbillon is really not intended for today, right? It's a work of art, it's a marvel, it's a piece of horological history, and it adds value in that way. But in terms of putting this in a sport watch, some of them exist, right? AP does this with Royal Oak Tourbs, and there's been other companies that have done this like Laurent Ferrier, but it's a nice to have, and it's really not intended for sporting. So sure, it may add complexity and unreliability compared to something like a workhorse Rolex Sub or always Perpetual or something like that, but that's not what it's for. And so I hear all the time people say, oh, I bought a tourbillon and it stopped working or the timekeeping was off, and I thought, X, Y, Z, it was supposed to be like this. Unfortunately, today, it's really just a nice to have. It's cool, it's interesting, it's fun, but really ill-advised to be playing golf with a tourbillon. Though, hey, look at Richard Mille and the like. People do this every day. The choice is yours. Next, we have chronographs. Now, how could you complain about chronographs, right? They've timed everything from missions to space to races. Why would anyone complain about a chronograph? Well, the thing is with mechanical chronographs, especially with column wheel chronographs and the way the gearing and tooling works and moving parts and metal parts, over all the stress and forces of the moving parts, they wear away. And I hear complaints all the time from collectors that say, the hands don't align perfectly. The chronograph hand doesn't align perfectly at the 12 o'clock. It might be off by, 1/100th of a millimeter or something so minute where you would need a loop to see it, but sometimes it's not, right? So when you reset the chronograph hand, the hand flies back, but because of the tooling and the way that hand sits, it might be a tiny bit off. So if you purchase a brand new watch, you should say with great certainty it should be exactly aligned. They can do this if it's a high quality watch. But if it's a watch that's 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years old, the tooling and the way that the mechanical components have worn down over the years is probably going to have some variance there. So that's something to consider. So I hear a lot of complaints about chronographs from collectors. Oh, the hand doesn't align. This is not a great watch. This isn't something that we handle because we don't do a lot of vintage. But I do hear that from fellow collectors. And personally, with my chronographs, I understand that. I'm a vintage guy anyway. But I hear this all the time. And it's by design. Mechanical components do wear out. You can swap out the parts if you find them, but this is something that you have to consider. Now next is bezels. I hear this all the time. Bezels. Oh, the bezel doesn't click enough. The bezel's not smooth enough. And this is just sometimes feedback about different dive watches out on the market. Not a specific example that I'm giving you, but I do hear a lot of talk about bezels, especially Seiko watches with the bezels aligning with the dial and the chapter ring. Happens all the time. Now, if the bezel is totally off and doesn't click, and the retention ring that holds that bezel into place that essentially makes it click compared to the case and the friction, I get it. It's a bit of a sliding scale on what you prefer, but there's going to be variance between the brands, the models, the watches, how often you use the watch, what kind of chemicals the watch has been exposed to, has it been in the pool, what's the lubrication look like. Once again, mechanical parts wear out, and so I do hear complaints from watch collectors about watches that exist and the bezel wasn't tight on this particular model, or the bezel did this or the bezel did that. I personally, as not only primarily a collector, I was a collector far before I was involved in the professional level of watches, I didn't really mind. I'm really not using the bezel for anything. I don't know how many of you out there are saturation divers or divers where you really need to use this as a backup. Otherwise, you probably have a diving computer anyway. Do any of you out there use, your dive bezels? I would love to see it and hear it in the comments below. But personally, I think this is kind of interesting, the way brands handle the bezels a little bit different, and this doesn't bother me, and generally most people it does not as well. Now lastly, this is a major complaint about the Omega Seamaster watch quite frequently. This is going to be the Helium escape valve. They say, oh, it looks so bad over there where it's placed, it doesn't belong on the watch, it's useless, this and that. I get it, it's kind of been grandfathered in. Now the Helium escape valve is essentially intended once again for these saturation divers that spend a lot of time down in the water, diving very deep, spending long periods of time doing things like, welding oil rigs out there in the ocean and things like that. They spend time in these compression chambers, and essentially they need to be able to let the helium escape from the watch, so the crystal's not going to pop off, something like that. It's made for these extreme conditions, and apparently you could be using this in other conditions as a diver as well, not just the most extreme saturation divers. But it is a nice to have, right? You don't really hear about people complaining that, oh, a certain watch may be rated for 1,000 meters or anything like that. It seems like it's more of a complaint on what it does aesthetically to the watch. So maybe there could be a different way that the helium escape valve could be implemented on the watch, in so of a way to not take away any kind of, continuity, I guess, on the profile of the case. I get this all the time. If you're one of these people that leave in the comments below on my Omega Seamaster videos, leave that down there. I would love to engage in this conversation again. But the helium escape valves, I get this complaint all the time. Doesn't bother me. I think it's a kind of a cool feature to have, a little bit of an interesting talking point. And that's what watches oftentimes are, right? First of all, we don't really need to wear these things. The complications, we have phones. What do we need the complications for? It's a hobby, it's enjoyment. We do it because we like it. And the helium escape valve doesn't bother me in the least bit. What do you guys think about these complications? Do any of you have opinions on them? I would love to see it and hear it in the comments below. Please do not forget to thumbs up, like, and subscribe. I really do appreciate it. You can check out delraywatch.com and my Instagram, TheRealJohnP. Thanks, guys. You've been chatting with John P.